The requirements for this assignment, or the things you need to know before you should do this assignment, is that you've gone through some of the lectures in the past around getting a command shell inside the container, and also some of the basics around Linux distributions and how they might differ, and of course running a container. Okay, here's another assignment for you, and it's going to be a little different than your traditional developer meets container scenario, but it's just as valid and just as common in the real world. In the past, you might have set up a whole virtual machine just to simply test something like a different command line version or a different Linux distribution. But with containers, that gets way easier. So imagine yourself being a support engineer for a server farm that runs both Ubuntu and CentOS, and a ticket comes in that asks you to check on the different curl versions in those two distributions. So in the old pre-container world, you'd probably have to set up a virtual environment and wait for operating systems to install unless you had them ready. But in this world, we can actually just run a few commands. So really the goal here is just to run the curl version command inside two different Linux distributions in just a few minutes. So we'll be using the CentOS 7 version and then the Ubuntu 14.04 version. You'll want to use the -it on your Docker run command and give it the bash command at the end. And then there's a new option you should try, which is the --rm, which will save you some time later. So I recommend looking that up through help on the command line or through the Docker support site at docs.docker.com. And really, once you're in there, and oh, by the way, you definitely want two different terminal windows so that you can switch back and forth between these two. And in order to run the curl version command, you're going to need to update each one of the distributions or check whether or not curl is installed. So I've given you some commands there that they're a little bit different between the two. And really, this exercise isn't going to give you an interesting output. It's really just helping you understand how easy and quick you can jump into different software or Linux distributions, run some tools, and then get out. And in the end, I would expect you to have different curl versions in those two distributions. Okay, this is a lesson where I'm going to walk through the assignment for the CLI app testing, and you can see my thought process as I just sort of talk out loud while I do it. Okay, so I'm going to need to start two Linux distributions. I'm going to need to use the RM, so Docker container run RM. Let's see, I'm not going to want to run it as a daemon, but I am going to want to use IT. CentOS 7. I don't need a port open, but I do need to get bash. Okay. And then I'm going to need to do yum update curl. And then while that's going, I'm an iterm2, and iterm2 is my terminal command. So command shift D will give me another window, another shell. So I can then do Docker container run rm it Ubuntu 14.04 bash, and then do an apt get update, then apt get install curl. I'm actually going to throw in a -y so it automatically does it. And then up here I can do a curl version while that one's going. All right, and it's got curl version 7.29 installed. And then Ubuntu. All right, curl version. All right, in Ubuntu it's 7.35. And I just happen to know that CentOS tends to lag behind. It's a more enterprisey Linux distribution, so it tends to have older package versions than Ubuntu, even though we're actually running a Ubuntu version that's more than a few years old. Okay, so when I type exit, I shouldn't see my container in there anymore. Nope. And then up here, if I type exit, and I do another listing, you'll see that the only thing left is an Nginx container I had left over from a previous unrelated session. So my CentOS disappeared and my Ubuntu disappeared, which is what the -- rm does for us. All right, and that's it. Nothing to clean up. The requirements for this assignment are very similar to the last assignment. You'll need to know how to get into the shell of a container when you run it or after the fact, and know some basics around Linux distributions and what something like Ubuntu might be different than Alpine or CentOS. And of course, running a container. And then the basics of how DNS records might work, like what an alias record is or how to create one. That would be handy because you're going to be doing some testing around DNS. For your next assignment, we're going to do some DNS round robin testing. And if you're not familiar with DNS round robin, it's the concept that you can have two different hosts with DNS aliases that respond to the same DNS name. So when you think about something like google.com, obviously they got more than one server. So one of the techniques that big companies use to always make sure they're up 24/7 is to employ DNS round robin as part of their strategy, so that there's actually multiple IP addresses and DNS records behind the name you're using on the internet. Now in containers, it actually gets a lot simpler. So here, we've actually got this feature in Docker Engine 1.11 and newer. We've had a feature where if we create a custom network, we can actually assign an alias so that multiple containers can respond to the same DNS name. So for this one, you're going to first create a new virtual network, call it whatever you want, and you're going to set up two containers using a new image called Elasticsearch, and specifically the version 2 of Elasticsearch. So Elasticsearch isn't really a part of this course, but it's becoming a popular data store for, well, really just for search, hence the name, right? So it's actually in a JSON format when you hit it from curl. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually use it as a quick test because it's really easy to use in this scenario. So you want to research and check out the -net-alias command. That's actually an option for Docker run. And so when you start a container, you're going to tell it, I want another DNS alias to call this container by, not just its container name. And this gets around a little problem that if you've ever used Docker in production and you've started to add a lot of containers, you realize you can't add multiple containers with the same name, but how can I resolve DNS on my networks and maybe have the same app installed twice? Maybe I've got a dev and a test environment on the same Docker server, and I need to, in both of those, call something search in the DNS. Well, this is how you get around that limitation. You can just keep adding net aliases to your containers when creating them, and you'll find out that they can actually respond just like a DNS round robin does. So once you've started those up, you can use the Alpine image to do an NS lookup, and that'll simply return to you a list of the DNS addresses for the name search. And remember, on that one, you're going to have to make sure that it's signed with the --net to the same network that you assigned the first two containers. And then after you've got both of those containers resolving to the same search name, you can actually use the curl command to get a quick output of the Elasticsearch server. And this is a little trick with Elasticsearch and why it's good to use in this demo. The curl command actually comes with the CentOS image, so it's easy to just use CentOS in this case instead of Alpine or Ubuntu. And also, Elasticsearch runs on port 9200, and since it returns an easy, short JSON result, it's quick and easy for this test. And lastly, Elasticsearch actually gives random names to itself inside its configuration when it first starts up. It's kind of similar to how containers give themselves random names if you don't specify. So what we can do here is if you keep running that curl command over and over, you'll actually notice that the output, even though you're using the same search DNS name to do a curl on, you'll actually flip back and forth between the two different Elasticsearch containers. And it might not be even. It's not going to exactly be one then the other, then the first one, then the second one. It's going to be a little off because that's kind of one of the downsides of DNS round robin is it's not a true load balancer. I like to kind of call it the poor man's load balancer. But in this case, it'll give you a sense of how to use a virtual network with DNS built in to make it easy to use multiple containers that have the same name. And as always, you can skip to the next lecture to watch me walk through it as I would do it. But you might get to the same end result with typing slightly different commands or launching your containers slightly different way. Okay, for this tutorial, I'm going to go through the assignment of DNS round robin testing, and you'll get to see how I would have done it. So first I need to create a network. I'm going to call it dude. And then I need to create 2 containers. So I'm going to run them in the background. And I don't actually care about their names. So I'm just going to run the network and attach them to dude. And then I'm going to do a net alias so I can find them with the DNS name search. And then there we go. Now, because I'm not specifying a name, I can actually just hit the up arrow and type the exact same command again. And I should get both of those containers. Now, I didn't open any ports because all we need to do is test inside of this virtual network. And you'll notice that there's exposed ports, which we'll talk about later in the next section. But exposed ports are listed in the Docker file, and they're always exposed in the virtual network. And it's only necessary to use the -p when we want to actually publish those ports to the outside interface of our host. And we're not doing that here, so I can skip that part. So now I need to run a test to make sure I can get to both of these with the same DNS name. So docker container run, and I'm going to do this the easy way by doing a --rm on alpine ns lookup search. Oops. Net dude. So this should run the ns lookup command on the search DNS entry and then immediately exit. And then it'll clean itself up with a --rm. All right, there we go. I have 2 DNS entries. And for the next one, docker container run rm net dude CentOS curl with a -s on search 9200. All right, that'll get me back the Elasticsearch server named Interloper. And if I run it again, I get the other one, Mr. M. And you'll notice that there's also a unique ID for each one of these, and that if I hit the up arrow and run this command over and over, it's not exactly going to be even Steven here. It's going to be a little random. You see 2 in a row and that sort of thing. And that's just indicative of DNS round robin due to things like name caching and whatnot. And if I do a docker container, container ls, so I can actually remove these. I'm going to force them. And there we go.